continue. Sheila is on the editorial board of the International Socialism Journal and make a contribution about the nature of women's oppression. So I will give you word and we can start. Like 30 minutes. Yeah, it's fine. Sorry?
You prefer less if I can?
Yeah, okay. So like 25 minutes, or I will sign you that. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank you for inviting me, and for me it has been absolutely fascinating to listen to all the contributions. I'm used to going to Germany and being in East Germany, but this is the first time I've been in the Czech Republic. And I was reminded today, going round the National Museum just up the hill, of 1968 and my response to 1968, because I was a student in 1968, and discussing it with my father and my mother, because we were as appalled by the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 as I was a campaigner against the war in Vietnam. And so it was, for me, 68 is both about one of the huge demonstrations against the war in Vietnam, but also about the invasion here. But I'm going to, and of course today, the fact that we live in a world where Donald Trump is the president of the most powerful country in the world and is an out-and-out racist and sexist and encourages both. And we've just been through the nomination and election of Kavanaugh, who is an anti-abortion judge to the Supreme Court in the United States. That is part of what is defining a polarization which is taking place across Europe and the United States between the rise of the right, which reinforce on racist grounds, but also which is right across Europe and the United States, but also reinforces sexism in society. We have that on the one hand, and the movements against. So I want very briefly and very sketchily to outline a particular understanding of social reproduction theory, which I believe is able to both explain what is happening to women in society, and I'm focusing particularly on the UK, but it's similar in other parts of Europe and the United States, to explain both what is happening in relation to the economic pressures and also to what is happening in terms of what gives rise to the Me Too movement and the fights around abortion, which was successful in Ireland. Now, Marx, and I'm an explicit, open Marxist of a particular kind, but nevertheless that is my framework. And Marx used the term social reproduction in a particular kind of way as a category for describing the totality of the way society is reproduced. But social reproduction theory is not about that. Social reproduction theory actually developed as part of the debates in the 70s about how to theorize women's oppression. And it was a debate which took place between people who were considered to be dual systems theorists, people like Juliet Mitchell, people like Heidi Hartman, and a group of Marxists, of whom people like Joanna Brenner, people like Lisa Fogel, people like Chris Harman, Lindsay German, who were single system theorists of the roots of women's oppression. And briefly to try to explain that, and it will be brief, is the dual systems theorists essentially argued that there was a system of patriarchy which explained women's oppression, whereas Marxists argued that actually women's oppression had to be explained out of A, the workings of class society as class society had arisen, but secondly, was rooted, the specific form of women's oppression that we know today was rooted in the dynamics of capitalism. And interestingly, for me, one of the reasons that people like Juliet Mitchell and Heidi Hartman argue for dual systems was because they argued that under socialism, women's oppression continued to exist. And therefore, socialism could not provide a solution to women's oppression. Essentially, the argument put by Marxist theorists in the, as I say, in the 70s and 80s was this, that, and this is in distinction to people like Silvia Federici, who was mentioned earlier, that the work done in the household is essential for society and is essential for reproducing the working class, because we're talking about the working class family, but is not necessary social labour as defined by Marx. It's not value-producing labour. And that distinction between value-producing labour was upheld and is upheld by Marxist theorists, and that therefore, however essential the work is in the family, it is not value-producing labour. And that is a major distinction between the likes of Silvia Federici and so forth. That's the first point. Secondly, that the working class family is, and therefore the position of women within it, has a number of implications. First of all, one of the things that Joanna Brenner and Maria Ramas argued was that, and which I agree with, is that the rise of capitalism and wage labour led to a separation between the workplace and home, which had devastating consequences for women, because it means that the child care becomes separate from the tasks that women used to be able to do in the household pre-capitalism. And because of this separation between workplace and home, and for other reasons, it fell to women inside the household to become not just the child bearers, but the child carers, and therefore subordinating their position inside society to men inside society, that the roots of the subordination lie in that inside the working class family. And one of the points made by Chris Harman was that in the, if I can find the quote, is that in the mid-19th century in London, in England, the reproduction of the workforce was only possible if the average working class wife had 8 or 10 pregnancies, simply because of the death rate. The conditions of life were so bad that the length of life was collapsing for the working class throughout industry in England. And this had a devastating impact on pregnancies and the survival rates of children. Now, one of the important aspects of this approach to looking at the working class family and working class life is looking at how changes inside capitalism drive changes inside the family and drive changes inside to what happens to women. So that it's really again, in the UK and the United States, the changes started to emerge through the 1930s, first of all in the First World War and in the Second World War, progressing through the 30s and the Second World War, with a bit of a glitch in the 50s, but then taking off again through the 1960s. A number of things actually happened. Firstly, the survival rate in terms of childbirth, the infantile mortality rate dropped dramatically through cleanliness and clean water and housing and a whole number of other things which took place. Secondly, the number of children which women had, with the advent of contraception and then later abortion, women could actually control the number of children that they had. So the numbers of children which women were choosing to have declined dramatically. And it reaches a stage with this being a period of a huge expansion. It's known as the 30 Glorieuses in France, or the 30 glorious years. The huge expansion after the, starting again in the 30s and carrying on after the Second World War, pulled women into the workforce. It also caused mass migration, normally from the former colonies, into places like Britain, but also into Germany and France and so on and so forth, so that women were brought into having two roles, one in paid work and the other continuing to uphold the household through childcare and contraception, through childcare and housework. And in the 1960s, when you had a whole explosion of social movements arising, the civil rights movement in the United States, the civil rights movement in Ireland, you had the explosion then of the women's liberation movement. It was shaped differently in the UK from in the United States. The influence of socialist activists was much greater in the UK than in the United States, simply because you have a stronger labour tradition, trade union tradition, and also Marxist tradition in the UK than in the United States. Plus the fact that there was throughout Europe, including in the UK, there was a rising tide of working class struggle, which actually shaped the movements which emerged. You then had the coming together of the needs of women workers who were putting forward, who were coming up against the barriers inside the workplace of inequality, whether it came to the question of pay, whether it came to the question of discrimination, the kind of jobs that women could get inside the workplaces, plus students, because the huge expansion of the student world, of university education after the Second World War, meant there was a whole generation of young women going into university education who had aspirations for equality and suddenly were coming up against the fact that they were treated differently, they came up against the sexism. And the combination of women workers, and there was a very important strike in the Ford's Dagenham factory in 1968, which symbolized the emerging demands by women workers themselves, shaped initially the women's liberation movement in the UK around demands for childcare, free contraception and abortion, 24-hour nurseries, concrete demands to bring about the possibility, to try to realize the possibility that women would both be able to work on an equal basis as men, but also be able to bring up children without the burden of that falling on their shoulders. Now, as things shifted, the other issues emerged. There was always the question of sex discrimination, but then the question of domestic violence, the question of rape. All of these questions also emerged in the late 70s and in the 1980s. Now, initially, one of the things which is interesting from my point of view, for the UK, and I think also for the United States, but also Germany, which I know a little bit about, Western Germany, one of the things that the student movement did in particular was to power a notion of freeing sexuality. The idea that women had the right to enjoy sexuality. It was a point at which, people started to talk about women's right to orgasm, and to break out of the straitjacket of you could only have sex in marriage, the argument that women and men should have access to contraception. It's really the women who wanted the contraception, access to the pill independently of whether they were married or not, because the initial contraception was only provided in family planning clinics and only if you were married and so forth. So that whole push to open up the space for women to control their own sexual lives and to control their own bodies emerged as part of that kind of movement. And that's when you see legislation, the abortion legislation came in 1967, but that was then followed by a whole raft of other kinds of legislation, which actually gave a formal equality to women alongside men in lots of ways, because women hadn't been able to open up bank accounts, hadn't been able to get higher purchase, mortgages and things like that on it. So that a kind of formal equality was then established on the backs of this movement. But with the decline of all the social, and of course you had a hugely important part of that which continued to have a role, was the explosion of the LGBT movement, with Stonewall and the impact that had in terms of opening up the space for gay and lesbian relationships, and then later, because it has come later, the whole question of the right to be trans and bisexual and so forth. But the interesting thing is that one of the, that supposedly freeing up of sexuality, if you like, has become subject to commodification in exactly the same way as capitalism has commodified every other aspect of human life. I mean, originally, the drive to commodify everything in the home, that everybody has an individual washing machine, has an individual, all the different artifacts in the home which was supposed to make life easier, was accompanied also by advertising which put women's bodies at the center of everything. So if you wanted to buy a car, it would be a woman's body which would be used to sell it, and the same right across the board, that central to advertise to the selling of commodities became the sexualization of those commodities through the use of women's bodies. So from the idea that women should have greater control over their own bodies and greater sexual freedoms became subverted as part of the process of commodification inside society. And this process of the commodification of sexuality is combined with, as the movements receded through the 1980s and 1990s, combined with the impact of the market and neoliberalism from the late 70s onwards, has created a mix of women's sexuality being subordinated to men and commodified and alienated all at the same time. And if you look at the statistics, I mean, one of the things that it's not just a question of the way women's bodies became used in advertising and now in social media, and as we saw before, how women themselves participate in that process in terms of shopping for different kinds of clothes and the 1 million hits that gets. You know, you take out the clothes out of the basket, but how you present your image in social media, that is a kind of subordination of women's bodies by women themselves, which runs completely counter to the kind of aspirations of the women's liberation movement of the 1960s. But it's not just about the makeup and the clothes and the way of behaving. It's also about women's bodies being fashioned under the surgeon's knife, literally, and the use of Botox and other things to actually refashion women's bodies in the images, and increasingly people report about women's bodies being refashioned according to the way in which pornography, which is now much more prevalent through social media, is also present in society. Now, I think it is that which really underpins the sheer outbreak of response to the Me Too movement in the United States, right across the world. If you think that, I mean, some of the most highly paid women in, you know, United States society in films, who are part and parcel, have been part and parcel of the sexualization process through film, then explode against this process in reality. The echo that has had is actually an illustration of the way in which this takes concrete form. And there was a survey done by the unions in 2016 in the United Kingdom, which is called Still Just a Bit of Banter. And it showed that in the United Kingdom, 85% of 18 to 24-year-olds suffered from unwanted sexual attention in public places, with 45% experiencing unwanted sexual touching. The most vulnerable women are those on temporary or 0 hours contracts, in more junior roles and less likely to be unionized. 80% of this sexual harassment took place in the workplace, and another 14% at social events which were related to work. And the overwhelming majority of women don't report to the event for fear of not being taken seriously or for fear of losing their job or being victimized. And of course, if you're a black woman, your vulnerability is compounded by the racism that you experience. And the sexual harassment is compounded by, for young black women. And the figures for rape, approximately 85,000 women and 12,000 men are raped in England and Wales every year. Nearly 500,000 adults are sexually assaulted in England and Wales each year. 1 in 5 women aged 16 to 59 has experienced some form of sexual violence since the age of 16. And approximately 90% of those who are raped know the perpetrator prior to the offence. Domestic abuse affects 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men in their lifetime. And there's an average of 2 women being murdered each week and 30 men per year, compared with 30 men per year. And there are more repeat victims for domestic violence than for any other crime, and is also the most quoted reason for becoming homeless. And about 400 people commit suicide each year who have already been to hospital because of domestic abuse injuries in the previous 6 months. So that whole question of the subordination of women's bodies and the sexualization and the subordination of women to men and the way in which the relationships are shaped through the family actually shows itself up then in these statistics of domestic abuse and sexual harassment and so forth. Now, the thing that I am just going to finish on is the way in which the there's been a long-term drive, really over the last 40 years, which has been accentuated since the financial crash, to worsen working conditions and social conditions right across the UK, and it's similar in the United States. It has had the impact of increasing the working week for women by 3 hours a week and for men for 2 hours a week, and has with pay being held down below inflation, the increasing low pay, and the cuts in the benefit system and the housing benefit system, the cuts in the way housing is provided means there's rising homelessness and lower provision of services which directly affect women in terms of whether it's provision of nurseries or whether it's provision of rape crisis centres or all those kinds of provisions. There's like a squeeze being going on which affects people directly in terms of what's happening to them at work and what's happening to them outside work in terms of the provision of services. And of course all of these compound the things that I was talking about earlier. Now, the final thing I'm going to say is, fortunately, it's quite clear that there is huge resistance to this, that I think the explosion of demonstrations when Trump was elected, which has again happened right across the world. I mean, we had a demonstration in the summer because Trump, he didn't actually come to the centre of London because of the demonstration, because people knew. I mean, it was about 500,000. It was absolutely massive, and it was young, and it was mixed. It was just a huge explosion of the way in which people feel about the way society is going and what Trump represents in terms of the sexism and racism. And as I said before, the reaction we've seen recently in the United States to the election of Kavanaugh is part and parcel of the resistance, and that's repeated in other parts of the world. There's stuff happening in India at the moment. But Ireland is the way in which the campaign to get rid of the paragraph in the Constitution which prohibited abortion, that campaign was, again, I think it was a lightning rod, because it was a lightning rod for the fact that young working class women in particular, but also working class men, were saying, we're not having our lives dictated to by the church and by the state in the way that it has been up to now. We want to actually have controls over our lives in this aspect, and that comes on the backs of the struggles that the winning a referendum over gay marriage, which happened a couple of years earlier. And really shows the kind of resistance which I think is possible. Right, so the final thing I want to say is this. These social movements show, I think, a level of anger about what is happening to people inside society. I think the major problem that we face is how we can combine that anger and strength of feeling that people have with successful collective struggle, not just to fight over the individual issues, but to combine them together to transform the societies in which we live. Because as a Marxist, I think that capitalism will continue the way it is going unless we stop it, unless we change it. And I think the anger is there. It explodes on occasions, but I would see we actually have to try to persuade people that they do actually have the potential power to completely transform society. And it's a transformation in society that we need if we're going to do something about all these issues.
So thank you very much for your contribution, and now it's time for questions. Is there some questions? So please go on. No, so I will start with one question, please. And I am interested in one thing that is how like this kind of liberation ideas or became like a really part of the system. Like you know, you very nicely describe it how like these kind of liberation of the sexuality and of the woman. For example, you very nicely said that anti-conceptions was really part of the, you know, like became in one day like a very empowerment that she is not like it's not necessary to be reproductive in a way or to have a children. So I'm interested in this turn when these like liberation movements became commodified by the system, and how like how it's a really difficult questions. How like how it happened, this commodification? You know, like or how like face this kind of commodification of these liberation movements or socialist movements that really like somehow formed the neoliberal system, let's say. Well, I don't know. It's a really difficult question. If you can like. Yeah.
Well, it was part of a process, because initially the late 50s and 60s and the opening up of the 1960s was about getting rid of censorship. There was a famous trial about Lady Chatterley's lover, or D.H. Lawrence's book, which opened things up. And through that period, through the period of the 50s and 60s, there was a generalized opening up of throughout society on the question of sexuality being part of being human, and therefore people having the right to good sex lives, and women therefore having a right to good sex lives, and therefore, and by extension, young women saying, well, we have the right to a sex life, because young men have kind of always taken their, been able to, because they didn't get pregnant. Now, it was possible to see that certain newspapers, which became extremely popular, The Sun, Murdoch's, and he's been a major player in Australia, in the UK, and in the United States as well. Was the first one to put a half-naked woman on what was called Page 3. And it became, partly because of the sport, the fixation with sport, it became the best-selling newspaper and therefore it made part of the culture the viewing of women's breasts, right? And at the same time, in terms of films and plays and so forth, getting rid of prudishness is also about being able to show people naked, because instead of having to cover up, you don't cover up. And instead of, you're not allowed to show men and women having sex, you're allowed to actually show men and women having sex. Now, if that is driven by a move in society, by a movement of people who want to treat one another more equally, and when the idea of being gay and lesbian is part of it, if it's part of an emancipatory project, it's fine. But once that emancipatory project begins to retreat, which is what happened towards the end of the 70s, there was a rightward shift. Now, the rightward shift happened because fundamentally the workers' struggles through Europe were defeated. They were defeated in Italy, in the UK, ultimately in France, although it re-rose in France because they're more combative, they're better at fighting. But they went into decline, and you could feel it. I was in Birmingham at the time. And as they went into decline, more right-wing ideas, more racist ideas, actually you began to get the rise of the fascists. If you look in France, in UK, and in Britain, and you began to get a pushback from the right, which was took the form of an attack on political correctness. And it starts in this period where there's a whole attack, oh, that's politically correct. And I can't remember who used the phrase, but it was an attack on it came from the United States with an attack on all the equalities legislation, which was about getting rid of racial discrimination in the United States. It was the beginnings of a pushback of saying that, because positive discrimination was about if you have black and white candidates and they're all equal, then you take a black candidate. If you have men and women candidates and they're equal, then you take the woman candidate, right? That's what positive discrimination was about. And the pushback against that was over political correctness, and therefore the beginnings of the undermining of the notion that it was good to be in favour of equality. And as you pushed back the notion of equality, at the same time there's a push forward about boys will be boys, men are being demasculinized by these two dominant women. That whole discourse began to take off and began to become dominant in society. And that is the mechanism by which, in the end, sexuality was commodified and played back and is internalized. In the schools in the UK, the behavior in teenagers, of what girls expect to service boys sexually in a way that my generation was rebelling against. And it's anyway, I don't know whether that helps.
Yeah, sorry.